everyone, it's Shar. Welcome back to my channel and welcome back to my apartment in Florida. Besties, I'm doing a video that I have not done since May. That is right. It is a June and July wrap up, including June in this one, just because in June I only read 2 books and it wasn't enough to make its own video, but now it can come into July. So I'm going to break down some really basic stats for you for my reading throughout the months of June and July. Throughout June and July, I read 7 books in total. Of those books, I gave 2 of those books 5 stars. I gave 4 of those books 4 stars, and I gave 1 of those books a 2.5 stars. And if you saw my Summerween vlog, you know exactly which book got that rating. I would do more in-depth stats, but that's kind of all I want to tell you about my reading. So let's jump into the actual review and breakdown of the books that I read. So I'm going to go in order of my reading. So the first book that I finished in June was Do Your Worst by Rosie Danan. This is a story about a curse breaker who goes to Scotland because she's hired to break a curse on this castle that no one has been able to break, and the investors really want to turn the castle into kind of like a B&B situation for local tourists. So she goes and she realizes that the castle is actually a historical property, and because of that, the investors were also legally required to hire an archaeologist to preserve any of the historical items in there that could not be destroyed, and they butt heads immediately. She thinks he's super hot, they almost hook up, and the next day she overhears him having a conversation about how she's a fraud and is just out to scam them for their money, and that ensues the whole chaos. I gave this book 4 stars. I did really enjoy this, and I like the banter between the 2 characters a lot. My initial impressions were like I was having a fun, silly, goofy time, but when we actually got into how the curse was affecting this couple in the story, I was like, that's pretty obvious. And at a certain point, the whole hate to love dynamic started to feel just a little bit childish in the way that they act things out. Although I will say the author tried to explain this as it being the influence of the curse. I enjoyed the story. It was what I needed at that time. I wouldn't consider this an all-time favorite, but it was still good enough for me to give it a 4 stars. Then I had my first 5-star read of June. This also happened to be the last book that I read in June. This is Devon and Chris Plan a Wedding. This is a sapphic romance about 2 women who enter a reality show, and they're entering the reality show for their own personal reasons. But the general premise of this show is that 2 complete strangers are paired together, and then they have to convince their families that they are suddenly engaged and getting married, and they also have to have their families help them plan this wedding, and a bunch of ridiculous scenarios ensue. This book also features a later in life coming out, and then Chris is a masked lesbian, and I feel like that's not representation I often see in sapphic romances, so I really enjoyed that. I thought Chris was so freaking suave. I love the exploration of the later in life coming out. The reality TV show premise was generally hilarious, and I found myself as I was reading this thinking this would make such a fun like rom-com movie. It had all of the vibes. If I'm being 100% transparent, this book was like a 4.75 for me, but I'm gonna call it a 5 stars because I really loved it. If you're looking for a sapphic romance, I highly recommend that you check out Devon and Chris Plan a Wedding, especially if you like the whole Hollywood, exploring sexuality, reality TV show component. Now let us move forward with July. And before I tell you about the books that I finished in July, I have to tell you about the book that I DNF'd. I DNF'd Raiders of the Lost Heart, and I actually do have this book up here. It's like right here, but I'm not gonna pull it. That feels like a lot of work right now. Raiders of the Lost Heart has such a beautiful cover, and it is about 2 archaeologists, supposed to be like Tomb Raiders or Indiana Jones, with a romantic setting, and they are in Mexico, and they're trying to find this artifact for this kind of man who essentially is a legend at this point. Our female main character, Corey, is an expert in the field, and she really understands what it is that she's doing. She's dedicated her life to this, and she feels she has very strong cultural ties to this, as a Mexican American woman herself. And then we have the male character Ford. The guy who plays Indiana Jones. Yes, the hero's name is Ford, who is a privileged, entitled, whiny white man. And me describing it that way should tell you what it is. I got to page 60 something or so before I was like, abso-fucking-lutely not. This man is insufferable. Literally the epitome of white privilege. Literally the epitome of gaslight. But also gaslight and not understand why people are upset with you. The way that he tried to use her work to get a paycheck and then discredit her for it, I was only 60 pages in. And we're supposed to be swooning for this man, and all he did in his point of view was talk about how sexy she is and how he wants to fuck her. That does not convince me that you like her. It convinces me that you don't have basic human decency, you don't respect her, and you're literally a disgusting fucking person. When I DNF'd this, for those of you who watched that vlog, many of you told me in the comments of that video that DNFing it was a good decision because it does not get better and that man was truly awful. And I'm here to tell you, cute cover, do not be deceived. This is the worst fucking hero I've ever read. Now that I'm done being a hater, let's talk about the books that I finished. I'll be a hater in a few minutes, but give me a second here. So the first book that I finished in July was The Girls Are Never Gone, which is a book that my friend Taylor recommended to me on Discord, and it was such a good pick. This is literally the definition of a sharp book. This is a sapphic book. It is YA, and it has a haunted house. I love a haunted house story. So in this story, we are following our main girl, Dare. And Dare is finishing up high school. She's about to transition to college, and she just went through a breakup. But Dare was the star of this kind of like web podcast that she did with her boyfriend. And they broke up as she stepped away from it. And now she's trying to do her own solo project. And the first thing she's taking on is this notoriously haunted house in this part of, like, I want to say Virginia or something. She has the ability to work on a restoration project, and of course while she's there, she's investigating the spirits. But she didn't hear about this on her own. One of her subscribers actually reached out to her and said, hey, I am working on this house. We have an open spot and I really, really desperately need your help. This house is haunted and I feel like I'm losing my mind. She goes and she is investigating the haunted house. It has like some mixed media elements. The audiobook narration for this is so, so good. And then we have like this fun friendship dynamic between three female characters, and two of them have a crush on each other. And yes, of course, one of them is Dare. I just thought the atmosphere in this was so much fun. I also love some of the lighthearted elements of it. It had the potential to be absolutely horrifying, but because it's a YA, I think that lightened the tone a little bit without taking away any of the eeriness and generally spooky vibes that were going on throughout the story. I adored this. I gave it 4 stars just because it's hard for me to give YA 5 stars. My gosh, this was like the definition of book that I loved. Like, this is a sharp book through and through, and it was such a win, which I'm so happy about. The next book that I read was during Summerween, and I read Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. First, I want to acknowledge, yes, this book definitely has its audience, and I certainly know people who read this and loved it, and it was just everything that they wanted, and I'm definitely not discrediting that in any way. This is about a man who worked on a movie called Horror Movie in the 90s, except that tragedy kind of happened and this movie ended up never being released, except that several like clips, 3 clips of the movie were released, and somehow it gained like this massive legend and legacy, and it has a huge fan base. People are obsessed with it, and people love speculating about like why the movie was never released and like what really happened and all these crazy things. This man who played the Thin Kid, we never get his name, he's only ever referred to as the Thin Kid. He is the only survivor. The entire cast and crew at this point is dead, and now Hollywood is rebooting this movie, and he has the chance to work on the production of this movie. And we're understanding what happened back then with the original Horror Movie. Why is he now the only survivor? What I will say is that the audiobook for this is chef's kiss. Like, truly one of the best produced audiobooks I've listened to. The full cast, the sound effects, the music, the pacing, like all of that worked really, really well together. And while I was reading the story, I certainly was immersed into it. I was invested in what was happening. I enjoyed the sets. There were times where I was disgusted, but what I mentioned in the vlog that I'm going to mention here, this book is about bullying. Like, the movie is about bullying, and there is, of course, more depth to it, but some of the scenes that happen were just, like, disgusting, like, truly horrifying, and I found myself thinking, wow, I hope the thin kid gets his revenge. Also, the last chapter of this is fucking ridiculous. No. And I know it's a very divisive chapter. People who read it either absolutely love it, feel okay about it, or absolutely hate it. For me, I was like, this is so pretentious, and please stop talking to me. Like, that is just how I felt. I did not like this book. It was a story that I read. Was it enough to finish? Sure. But the audiobook was doing 99% of the lifting for this story, because what story? The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. Ooh, if you're bouncing, it's because I was dancing. Sorry. The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon is a very atmospheric story, and we have two different timelines here. We have the timeline in the early 1900s where a woman meets her tragic end. She disappears for a while. She has a tragic end, very tragic life up until that point. And then we are in present day at the time that this book was set, where we are in that same house, but now of course it's a new family, and we're following our teenage main character, Ruthie, as she's called. And Ruthie has a mother named Alice, and Alice disappears one day. She was acting hella weird, and then she's just gone. And Ruthie is now taking care of her little sister and trying to solve the mystery of what happens. But we also have the point of view of this, like, woman whose husband died, and he is somehow connected to this family. So she's also trying to solve that. I gave this book 4 stars because I mentioned, I think that it was really creepy, and I enjoyed the atmosphere of it. It has a very wintry, snowy setting. I believe it's set somewhere in Vermont or around that region. I think that was done very well. I could picture the setting very clearly, that the details were very well described. I think that the legends around what was happening was also very fascinating and really well developed. With that said, I had some issues with who the villain of the story is, and general questions about the representation of the native characters in this story. But again, that's not my lane, so it's not something that I can speak to, but I do want to acknowledge that there were times where I was like, I don't know about this. I also feel like by the time we got to the final quarter of the story, the author was asking a lot of the reader in terms of suspending disbelief, because the things that the characters just went along with, especially the adult characters, it very much felt like for the sake of the plot, and I was like, what the fuck is happening? It started to feel like a video game at some point. I still really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. It just wasn't the perfect read for me. Do you know what was the perfect read for me? The Haunting of Velkwood, which is undoubtedly one of my favorite books of the year, and perhaps one of my favorite books of all time. The Haunting of Velkwood is a speculative horror story that's really just a massive metaphor for grief and trauma. With that said, this is a story about a woman. I'm forgetting her first name. I want to say something like Talitha? I think it's Talitha Velkwood. And Talitha Velkwood is one of 3 survivors of the Velkwood mystery. There was this neighborhood that just kind of disappeared, managed to move between spaces, and now you can see the neighborhood and like ghostly remnants of the neighborhood, but no one can live there, and no one can actually enter there unless they're from that town. And again, it was a very, very small neighborhood. And there is a group of researchers who are now going back into the town and trying to do research, and Talitha agrees for her own personal reasons, and we're following her journey as she enters this weird kind of liminal space, and people who are quite literally trapped in time. It is so weird. It is so bizarre, but it's so freaking good. It's queer, y'all. It's queer. If you want to see my live reactions, watch my Summerween vlog part 2, because I think my reactions speak for themselves. I love this book so much. It is so strange, but it is exactly like the kind of horror I would love. I think that The Girls Are Never Gone and The Haunting of Velkwood are very good definitions of what I look for in speculative horror. And my gosh, just the way that this metaphor for grief and trauma was handled, and like the unique spin on this town that kind of sort of just disappeared and what was going on, and like all the mysteries wrapped up into it. Like, I was listening to this, and this is one of those audiobooks that when it finished, I was like, why is it over? Why is it over? I want to keep hanging out with them. What do you mean the story's done? So good. Obsessed. And finally, besties, this is a book that I technically haven't finished yet, but I'm going to be finishing it today. I only have 30 minutes left of the audiobook, so I'm going to include it in this wrap up. This is Truly, Madly, Deeply by Alexandria Bell Fleur. And I'm so happy to tell you all, this was a freaking win. I was mildly concerned because I didn't like The Fiancé Farce, but I really loved this one. And I had loved Alexandria Bell Fleur's like the astrology series before this, so this is so good. And we have two bisexual main characters, but let me tell you what it's about, and let me tell you accurately, because I think it's often pitched as they create a podcast together. That's like this much of the story. That's not even what happens. So we have a divorce lawyer, and then we have a romance author, and Truly writes queer historical romances. She's pretty well known, and she gets invited onto this podcast, and she is just talking about her experiences, and generally it's supposed to be like an advice podcast, Q&A style. And the podcast host invites her brother on. It's like kind of like a fun dynamic, and her brother Colin is a divorce lawyer. Truly and Colin butt heads, but their banter is like top tier. The audience ends up loving it. They do this a couple of more times, but that's not really the center of the story. The center of the story is Truly trying to understand her understanding of romance and love and relationships, and what her parents mirrored for her, and what that means for how she navigates love as an adult. The banter between these two is so good. The spice in here is up there. It's up there. I would say it's almost a little bit too much up there, because this man loves eating pussy, and that's not a bad thing, but like, it seemed like every few chapters he would be on his knees eating her out. And if I was in a different mood, that perhaps would have worked for me. But this was my commuting book, so I was often driving while I was listening to this. But again, banter is top tier. I loved all the characters in here. They all felt so fleshed out. I think that Alexandria Bell Fleur managed to balance the humor with the romance and the more serious elements really well in the story, where I feel like in The Fiancé Farce, the humor kind of took over the rest of the story. Not the case in this one. I think that Colin and Truly are quite cute together, and the main thing that I look for when I'm reading a romance is, am I rooting for this couple to be together? And I'm happy to tell you I am in fact rooting for this couple to be together. While I haven't officially finished this story, there's not much that could happen in the final 30 minutes of this book. Please don't let this be a jinx. That would change my opinion of this. So I think I'm going to settle on 4 stars. So with that said, besties, that does bring us to the end of this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you being here. If you did get to the end of this video and you want to let me know, you can leave me like a little candy emoji with my gummy bear lamp. Any candy emoji that you think, and I am going to see you in my next one. And y'all, it's so exciting. I'm so close to 1,000 subscribers, so just like thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, and I will see you on Sunday with a nice long vlog. Bye.